This is a tutorial on the notice to buyer to perform, the notice to seller to perform, and finally the demand to close, because these are all similar forms, similar functions, but they're all different. And they tend to work hand in hand. So let's go through together. We'll start with the most commonly used form, the notice to buyer to perform. Now, this form is referenced in the purchase agreement, paragraph 14, section E, notice to buyer or seller to perform. I'm not going to read this whole boring paragraph. I'm going to paraphrase and say that basically it says, if one party is misbehaving, the other party must put them on notice, wait 2 days, and then that party can unilaterally cancel. And I should say it's calendar days, not business days. So we go over here. Let me give you a really quick example of probably the most common way that this form is used. So let's say a seller is waiting on the buyer to remove contingencies, and the buyer hasn't done it, or they're not on time, or let's say it's day 17, because that's when most contingencies expire. Well, the seller can check this box, all contingencies, sign down here, and then send it to the buyer's agent and wait. And if the buyer's agent doesn't send a contingency removal within 2 days, then the seller can cancel unilaterally. And to give you an idea of how that looks, so today's Thursday that I'm recording this, that's day 0. The day that you deliver this to the other agent is considered day 0. So Thursday today is 0. We have to wait 2 days. Tomorrow, Friday, day 1. Then Saturday, day 2. If I don't have a contingency removal by Saturday, by the end of the day, then I can send a cancellation. That's the first thing I would do Sunday morning, is send a cancellation. So we'll go through this very quickly. It's a simple form. This form is the easiest in terms of the format. I'll show you how the other ones differ a little bit, but we put number 1 up here because this is the first usage of this form in this transaction. It's in accordance with the purchase agreement, the date of the purchase agreement, not the date that we're drafting this form, but rather the top left corner of the RPA, there's a date. That's what you'll put there. Property address, names of the parties. Here's the nice part. This is categorized or divided into 2 different categories. Contingencies. These are all the contingencies that the buyer can not remove on time. And then contractual actions. So these are lists of everything the buyer can do wrong. Are they not removing a contingency? Are they not performing an action? Now, I already gave you an example of a contingency not being removed, but let's talk about a different one. So sometimes agents will call me and they'll say, hey, the buyer never dropped off the EMD at escrow, and it's not going anywhere. Can we accept a backup offer? Can we send a cancellation? And my answer as a broker is no, you can't. Why? Because remember, we have this paragraph 14E that basically says if someone misbehaves, what do? You send a notice to perform, you wait 2 days, and you can see right here there's a line item for initial deposit. So you have to send a notice to perform, check this box, tell the buyer, hey, look, I'm putting you on notice. You have 2 days to deliver the earnest money deposit to escrow, or else we cancel. Then your client waits the 2 days, and then you cancel. That's how it works. Now, it can be a drag sometimes when the deal's dead in the water and you still have to wait 2 days. But keep this in mind. You can send these forms preemptively, but there's a limit. You cannot send this any earlier than 2 days prior to the expiration of a contingency or when the contractual action is due. So remember how I said a lot of contingencies expire on day 17? Well, you don't have to wait until the buyer no-shows on day 17. You can send this on day 15 and say, hey, look, I know everything's going fine. No problems. No one's done anything wrong yet, but I'm just letting you know that we're following a strict and punctual timeline. So you send this on day 15 saying on day 17, I check this box. I expect all contingencies to be removed. What happens if day 17 comes and you don't get all contingencies removed? The following morning, you cancel. You don't have to wait for 2 more days, like I said in my first example. But you cannot send this earlier than 2 days, you can't send it day 14 or day 13 prior to the 17-day contingency expiration. If you do, it nullifies the form. It's as if you never sent it at all. So you got to make sure that your timing is done accurately. And seller's going to send the form. We're going to move on. I have to mention this. There's a little modifier here. Do not touch this. This is bait to make this whole thing. Cars should not have this in here. This is a problem. Agents try to make it less than 2 days. You're not allowed to do that. You can't make it more than days. There's absolutely no reason for this to exist here. Notice to seller to perform. Same idea as the first form. Looks a little bit different, but it reverses the parties. So we put number 1, first time it's being used, date of the RPA, property address, names of the parties. Now, just like the last form for the buyer, this is split into 2 divisions, 2 different categories. Contractual actions, there's a lot of them here. They basically all pertain to disclosures and the seller furnishing information. And then we have contingencies, which is really only one, and it's rarely used. It's a seller's purchase of replacement property. And so obviously, if the seller has this contingency and it's expiring or ending, and the buyer wants to put the seller on notice to remove that contingency, you check this box. Up here, this is if the seller's dragging their feet on delivering a disclosure for the most part. Now keep this in mind, even if the buyer removes all contingencies in writing, and the seller, let's say a new material fact surfaces late in the transaction, if the seller doesn't furnish it, the buyer has to send a notice to perform for some new disclosure that came up, and the seller doesn't perform and the buyer cancels, it's almost certain the buyer is going to get their earnest money deposit back. Now, that's an unlikely scenario that it would come to that's a rare circumstance, but I'm just telling you that this actually protects the buyer. So if one party defaults and the other party has to cancel, as the buyer will get their deposit back if the buyer's the one that's canceling. And if the seller cancels because the buyer hasn't removed contingencies, I should mention this as well. If the seller cancels and there are contingencies, the seller is not entitled to the buyer's deposit. It does not work that way. I get asked that question a lot. I should mention that. Now, we have the same 2-day rule that we talked about, but there's actually one exception, 1L. We'll go up to L right here, removal of abandoned personal property. If this is what you're telling the seller to perform on, that seller has 3 days to perform, not just 2. But the buyer's going to sign it. Now, keep in mind, you don't need the other party to sign it. You're just delivering a notice. You sign it, you deliver it, you're done, and then you wait. Now we come to the demand to close. Sometimes agents call and they say, hey, we're supposed to close escrow today. The other party is not showing up or refusing to close or whatever. What do? Do we send a notice to perform? And I say, no. A notice to perform relates to all the other actions during the transaction. When it comes to enforcing closing, there's a specific form, the demand to close escrow, and there's a whole section dedicated to it in the RPA, which is paragraph 14, and this is G. And there are some differences, namely that there's a 3-day window as opposed to 2. And of course, like the notice to perform, you can't deliver it early. And you must give the other party 3 full days. Now, like I said, you can preempt it. If your close of escrow's on the 30th, you can send it over on the 27th, so that if the other party doesn't close on time, you can cancel the following day. But you got to be careful. You can't send it more than 3 days early, because that will nullify the form. It's like if you never sent it at all. So we have, by default, this is in accordance with the purchase agreement, the date of the purchase agreement, property address, names of the parties, close of escrow date. Okay, this actually is a mess. Seller hereby demands that buyer close escrow on the property. That's simple enough. Now, there's 2 options. There are 2 options here. One within, basically meaning as soon as possible, the sooner the better. So within, but it really can't be within. So this is why this verbiage here is absolutely terrible. But within 3, but no less than 3 days is specified in the agreement, because remember, you have to give a full 3 days, but then you also can't send it early. So this might be, so I would just say, go ahead and check this box and then don't put anything here. Don't put anything here. Or you could check this box and just put the close of escrow date. That's another safe bet. But you don't want to modify just because you have to be very careful not to. You can send it 3 days prior to closing. You can send it at closing. You send it the day after closing. You just can't send it any earlier than 3 days. And once you send it, whenever it is, you have to wait the 3 days. So as long as you follow that rule, you'll be fine. But I think this is very confusing here, how they put this modifier here and then they put this reminder, and it just. So we'll read this one too, or B. Now, if you could do either. You could just check this box. If you check 1A and leave it, you'll be fine, as long as you follow the timing rules I mentioned. Or you could check this box here and write the close of escrow date and the same date you put up here, and just wait, and you'll be fine. But this is very confusing and almost contradictory to the provisions in paragraph 14G. Just remember, 3-day waiting period, and you can't deliver any earlier than 3 days before close of escrow. And then you'll have a signature here if you're the seller. So there's, depending on which party is initiating this, you have the seller portion on the top or the buyer portion on the bottom, because both parties are sharing this form, but you don't have to sign it. The other party doesn't have to sign it. You just have to sign this form by the initiating party that's making the demand and then send it to the other party. And that is it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.